We've still got a couple minutes before we officially get started. But good morning.
Good morning.
It's good to see y'all. Visitors, we have visitors with us. Glad that you're here. Any updates on any of the sick or anybody we need to bring up in prayer?
I got a good report on cardiology, so I'll be able to get back to work now.
Great. Perry got a good report from the cardiologist. He has a heart. Barely. He walked in this morning. I said, "How you doing?" He said, "I feel great." And it's good to see you, buddy. Glad you're feeling better. Okay. Keep praying for Gloria. She's going through physical therapy still. Okay. Anybody else? So Tim Dye got a call from his brother early this morning, and 3 family members, distant family members, are planning to obey the gospel today. So thankful for that. Praying for them. It's great news. Anybody else? Greg Clayton, will you lead us in a word of prayer, please?
Most gracious and powerful Father in heaven, we thank you for this day. Dr. had some personal weekends to study, to uplift each other, dear Lord, by the way we visit each other and the way we study each other. Lord, I ask you to be with us as we study this morning, be with him as he brings us a portion of your word. Help us to study with open hearts and open minds and to apply it to every walk of life. Lord, there have been those that have been mentioned sick. I'm going to Dr. Terry and care for them. Lord, thank you for the ones that have decided to put on Christ and to be with them as they start their journey. Lord, thank you for us as a church here. Help us to reach out to our communities every day in Christ.
Amen. Thank you. Luke chapter 21. First of all, as you're turning there, let's thank Andy for the last 3 months. Thank you for the good teaching. Appreciate Andy and his class so much. Appreciated the opportunity to sit and learn from him and to have a little bit break. He came to me last fall and he said, "Hey, whenever you want a break, let me know. I'll take the class for a quarter." And I was happy to let him do that. But he was happy to turn it back over to me this morning. So he walked in. I said, "You ready for class this morning?" He looked at me like I was crazy. So we left off last week, Jesus answering these questions from the scribes and the Pharisees. Now, we're about to enter into, right, I mean, we're in it, but we're about to enter into the last days of Jesus' life. And he's in Jerusalem, and daily he's in the temple teaching. Now, he's actually in the inner part of the temple area itself, not out in the court of Gentiles that surrounds the temple complex. Was much larger. The temple itself sat in the center, actually the north center of the temple complex. There were barriers that were set up, and the Gentiles were not allowed to cross these barriers into the temple area itself. But once you crossed these barriers, you would go up a few steps into what was called the court of women, and this is where all Jews were allowed to assemble. This is where rooms were. There were rooms on the outer part of the temple area where they would gather for meetings and that kind of thing. There were storage rooms there. This is also the area where the collection boxes were. There were 13 collection boxes. There were 6 that were for offerings, for free will offerings, and then there were 7 that were there to pay the temple tax, okay, for the upkeep of the temple and for the Levites themselves. This is where they were, and this is where Jesus is going every day, and he's spending time teaching in this court of women inside the temple itself. I I want to pick up where we left off last week in chapter 20. We talked briefly there at the end of class about verses 45 through 47. Remember, Jesus talks about how these scribes were devouring widows' houses, right? And their life was all about the appearance, right? Andy brought this up last week about those that would stand on the street corner and give great prayers so that they may be heard of men, right? They would wear these shawls, really, these shawls that would go all the way to the ground, and they had tassels on the bottom of them. And as they would pass by in the marketplace and places, people were expected to stop and stand up and kind of honor them as they passed by. So when Jesus makes the comment that they wore long robes, verse 46, loved respects and greetings in the marketplace, the chief seats in the synagogues, places of honor at the banquet. In the synagogue, you had the pulpit area where they would teach from, and then next to that there would be some benches and seats. Those were the most honored seats. Everybody else would stand about the room and on the outside of the walls, and they would stand there. So these scribes, with their very fancy shawls on and their clothes and their robes and they would want the best seats, and they would want the best place in the synagogue and at meetings and banquets and in the marketplace, and it was all about the appearance. And they were devouring widows' houses to support their lifestyle. We talked about it throughout the Old Testament. We go back to Old Testament history, and we see in the kings of Israel and Judah, and God's either acceptance of them as good kings or his condemnation of them as bad kings, one of the two things that were always prevalent in deciding whether a king was good or bad was, one, whether or not they worshiped God the way God said to. And the second thing was, were they just and honorable to widows and orphans, to the poor? And that seems rather simplistic, but almost all of them are bad. Why? Well, because they didn't worship God the way they were supposed to, and they were not righteous and just towards the poor. And these scribes are just like them. Okay? And so he says there, they will receive a greater condemnation. Now, that doesn't mean, the first question I think that often comes up is, well, does this teach degrees of punishment? And I don't think that's what that means there. What that means, that there's greater condemnation, is that there is stricter judgment on them. They're going to be judged more strictly according to the word. There will be less grace given than to everybody else. And we talk about that as preachers, as elders sometimes, that Paul tells Timothy that there's a greater responsibility on those who preach the word. There's going to be greater judgment on those who preach the word. There's going to be a greater degree of judgment on those who lead the children of God in this world as elders, right? Because you have to look out for the souls of those under you. There's going to be a stricter judgment. And that's what he's saying here to them about these scribes. So, that being said, and again, this is one of those places where the chapter division doesn't really help, right? Because this story continues. What Jesus is saying here, the beginning of 21, has a direct relation to what he just said in chapter 20, at the end of chapter 20. So chapter 21, he looked up. So he's saying this. He's standing there in the courtyard, and he's talking to them about the scribes, and they saw him walking around. They could see him, and he's pointing them out. He said, look at them, with their long robes and their fancy clothes and their appearances, and they're devouring widows' houses. And just at that point, he looks up, and what does he see? the rich putting into the treasury. And he saw a poor widow putting in 2 small copper coins. 2 leptas. So, I brought for you to see this morning 2 leptas. These are 2 widow's mites. I promised Bo I would bring these in one day so he could see them. So I'll pass these around. Let's start over here. Here. I want these back. Randy. Randy, start. I bought these back in January at a coin shop when I was in Florida. So these are 2 small brass or copper coins, leptas. This is what she was putting in the treasury. 2 of these. You see how small they are. They may have been enough to have bought her a little food that day. I mean, it was probably worth the food for the day. And Jesus looks up and sees her putting in these 2 small copper coins. And he says, verse 3, truly I say to you, this poor widow put in more than all of them. Now I want you to imagine you're standing there, and you're standing there in this court, and there's crowded people everywhere, and you know, the scribes and the rich with their fancy clothes, and they're putting in, and you see the picture, and this is very similar to what the boxes would have looked like, and they had these metal horns on top of the box. They were shaped like this. Anybody know why they were shaped like a horn like this, upside down horn like this? Anybody have an idea? So nobody stick their hand in it and take it. It's harder to steal when you can't get your hand down in there, right? And so they would walk by, and the Jews could tell how much was going into the box by the way the coin sounded hitting the metal horn as they dropped the money in. 2 leptas, these 2 small copper coins, was by law the least amount you could give. This is the least amount you could give. Now, what did the poor widow have? She wanted to give, but by law, Phil, she could only give 2. She couldn't give less than 2. But that's all she had. So what did she do? She gave all. She gave everything she had. He says here, verse 3, truly I say to you, this poor widow put in more than them all, for they out of their surplus put into the offering, but she out of her poverty put in all that she had to live on. Now, a lot of times this text is used to talk about giving, right? Andy, I don't think that's what he's talking about here. I don't think he's talking about giving like we just did a few moments ago. What did she give? All that she had to live on. What was she left with? The value of what is given is not based upon how much is given, but on how much is left. How much is retained, how much is kept. Now, I think this is the point. Earlier in Luke chapter 9, Jesus says, you cannot be my disciple except you do what? Give up everything and come follow me. What was the greatest command? Mark 12, Luke 10, Luke 10, 27. The greatest, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. What does God want us to give him? What does he want us to retain? Nothing. What is she doing? And then what? What's going to happen next? She can't support herself. She's got no one to take care of her. What is she really saying in giving all? God will provide. She retained her hope, her faith and trust in God. God will take care of me. I think that's the point. Where did the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees, where did their hope lie? In the material things. Where did this woman's hope lie? In God. What is Christ trying to tell us here? Put your faith and trust where? Give him all. Retain nothing of your own, and put your full faith and trust in him. And we look at these coins and we think, man, it's so little. And in the great scheme of things, in this life, if I give up everything of this life, what am I really giving up? Is it just a little bit anyway? I mean, it already belongs to him. I've just been blessed with it. I can't take it with me. You know, I imagine these coins that were passing around at one point when they were first struck were shiny, nice, brand new. Now what? You know, now they're tarnished. You know, if they weren't kept in those little plastic holders I've got them in and kept in my safe with the dehumidifier in my safe, what would happen to them? But eventually, what's going to happen to them? Same thing's going to happen to everything else. Everything we have in this world is just really so little compared to what? What God has promised us in eternity. She gave a lot because she gave everything. Any thoughts or comments on that? That's right. Yes. Again, it's not. Yeah. Well, that's a great question. When he says here, truly I say to you, this poor widow put in more than all of them. Now, of them is in italics in my text. In the Greek, it's just the word all, but the word all there in the Greek means everybody. She gave in more than. So is he saying she gave more than everybody individually had given of themselves? Or is he saying that her gift was greater than all the others combined? And that may very well be true. I mean, the way the language is here, it would tend to make me think that as well. But again, it's not about the value, and I wrote this down. The value is not in what is given, but what is retained. Right? The value, she gave more than everybody else because she gave and retained nothing. They gave of their surplus, retained. But again, spiritually, don't we do that? We want to give God a little bit of ourselves, but we want to keep the greater part of ourselves. I'm guilty. Steve, that's hard to do. If I was this woman, and this is the last two leptas that I had, Phil, and I was hungry, I may not have went to the temple that day. I may have went to the marketplace. But her heart, again, her faith and trust in God. That's right. And I think, again, that's the lesson here.
You know, when we grow up, we learn that story in Bible class, and we grow up and we teach our kids that.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe we leave out that last statement, that the big, the punchline,
Yeah.
the end of it all was faith.
That's right. Right. And again, it's as a child growing up, I always heard this story, and it was always connected to our giving on Sunday. And I really don't think that's what it's about. It's much more to it than that. Now, is our giving on Sunday tied to that? Well, sure. But it's just a small part of that, right? My Christianity is not based upon how much or how little I give on the Lord's Day. It's about what I give to him every day of myself. It's about, again, it's about the heart. Yes. This is, I think this is the seventh time a widow is mentioned in the book of Luke. And there's a widow at the very beginning, and there's a widow here at the very end. And Jesus, Luke puts a lot of emphasis on the poor, the widow, the orphan, the dead, those who are struggling. Is it because he was a physician and he was more mindful of the suffering and that kind of, I don't know. But I think he's trying to tell us something here about these widows in their hearts and their desire. They had nothing, but Jesus gave them everything they needed. And that's a beautiful thought. Yeah. Caring for the fatherless and widows in their afflictions and keeping ourselves unspotted from the world. That's right. Are there people like that in our community? Are there people that have those kind of needs in our communities? What are we aware of those? Are we mindful of them? Are we compassionate towards them? Are we doing anything? Okay. Anything else? So we got the easy stuff out of the way from chapter 21. The rest of the chapter deals with the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, I want us to be clear, and we'll make this clear as we go through here. This entire chapter is about the destruction of Jerusalem. It has nothing to do with the end of times. It has nothing to do with the second coming of Christ. It has nothing to do with the end of days, the apocalypse. It had nothing to do with any of that. It has to do with the destruction of Jerusalem, which takes place just shy of 40 years after Jesus' death. Okay? And we'll prove that as we walk through this text together. But Jesus, beginning in verse 5, it says, while some were talking about what? They're talking about the temple. They're standing in the temple. They're standing there talking about it. And he's going to say here at the end of this, and some of the other Gospels allude to this, that Jesus will go out, and in Matthew chapter 24, 25, Jesus goes out from the temple and goes to the Mount of Olives. And he has a discussion there with his disciples. But he also has this discussion here in the temple itself. And so he goes back and forth. But he's here, he's in the temple. All these people are around. And the temple and the temple structure was absolutely breathtaking. It was one of the most beautiful things on the face of the earth at that time. They would marvel. There were stones in the wall that are still there today that are like 200 million pounds or some crazy number. They're like 40, the stone is like 40 feet long, 12 feet deep, and 8 feet high. How did they move that thing? The grandeur of the temple and the complex was amazing. And so they're standing there, and Jesus is teaching, and they're talking. Can you imagine? What would you do? When we go to sites like that today, maybe we go, you go to the Taj Mahal or something like that, and you're standing there. What are you going to do? Wow, look at this, right? And so they're standing around, they're looking at the temple and the complex, and they're talking about it. that it was adorned with beautiful stones and votive gifts. And Jesus says, as for these things which you are looking at, the day will come in which there will not be one stone left upon another which will not be torn down. All right. So what's he telling? One day, this temple in the center of this is going to be torn down. Not one stone of this temple. And he's talking about that area where the temple itself is. Okay? This temple is going to be torn down. Not one stone is going to be left upon another. One day this is going to happen. Now, as we go through here, I want you to be aware of this. Who is he addressing? He says in verse 6, these things which you are looking at. It's things which you are seeing. And again, it's the things that these people, as he's standing there, it's the things that they're standing there looking around at and talking about how beautiful and how marvelous this structure is. Notice how many times he refers to you people. You people that I'm standing right here with right now talking to. Okay? Verse 7. They, these people, questioned him, saying, Teacher, when therefore will all these things happen, and what will be the sign of these things when these things are about to take place? When are these things going to happen, and what are the signs? What's going to happen before, so we can know before the temple is destroyed? And he says, see to it that you are not misled. Again, who's he talking to? People standing there. Be concerned that you're not misled. For many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and the time is near. Do not go after them. When you hear, he doesn't say when people hear, when some people 2,000 years from now hear. He says when you hear. When you hear of wars and disturbances, don't be terrified. For these things must first take place, but the end does not follow immediately. Okay? Then he continued by saying to them, nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there will be great earthquakes in various places, plagues and famines, and there will be terrors and great signs from heaven. But before all these things, they will lay their hands on you. Before all of these things that take place, when these wars and rumors of wars and these terrible earthquakes and all these things are taking place, and Jesus is using apocalyptic language here. We'll explain that in a minute. He says they're going to lay their hands on you before this happens. They're going to lay their hands on you, and you will be persecuted, and you will be delivered to the synagogue and to prison, bringing you before kings and governors for my name's sake. It will lead to an opportunity for your testimony. When these things happen, you will be able to testify. So make up your minds not to prepare beforehand to defend yourselves. How many times has he already referred to you, yourselves, you people? I didn't count them, but I underlined all of them. For I will give you utterance, I will give you wisdom, which none of your opponents will be able to resist or refute. But you will be betrayed even by your parents and brothers and relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. And you will be hated by all because of my name. Yet not one hair on your head will perish, but your endurance, or by your endurance, you will gain your lives. Well, wait a minute, Lord. You just said that some of us are going to be hated, we're going to be betrayed, we're going to be put to death, and now you're telling us not a hair of our head will be lost. What do you mean? What's he telling us? If we're faithful to him, are we going to die? So I talked about it last hour, right? Do we know how we're going to die? When we're going to die? We may die peacefully in our sleep. Be great. I may die some tragic death. I may die some long, lingering, I don't know. But I'm faithful to him when this life ends, what? I will live on forever. What do I have to be afraid of? Do I have hope? That's what he's telling these people. A lot of bad things are going to happen to you guys, but you don't have to worry about it. Okay? Let me stop there for a second. Any thoughts or questions, concerns about that so far? Through verse 19. Again, I'm sorry, go ahead. This is scaring me right now. Phil's asking a question.
I don't know where it is in all these chapters, but the question may fit later on. But the destruction of Jerusalem, we view it as an event in Bible history.
Mm-hmm.
But does it actually signify the end or the destruction of the old law and the old Judaism?
Yes.
Is it the final day?
I think so. Yeah, and I think we will get to it here a little bit later in this chapter. I think there's indication of that. One of the keys to that is, what was most important to the Jews when it came to their lineages and stuff? The genealogies, the land promises, what tribe you came from, who could serve as priests, right? I mean, all those things were connected to your heritage, to your genealogies. Where were all those records kept? They were kept in the temple. What happened to them in AD 70? They were destroyed. There's not a Jew alive today who can tell you what tribe he's from. They can't. Because it was destroyed. And once that's destroyed, the system of Judaism is laid to rest. I mean, it can't continue. There's no way it can go on. But we'll come back to that in a minute. But yes. Anything else? But this is an actual historic event. In AD 70, the governor, the Roman general Titus, besieges the city. He surrounds the city. They come from all directions. They surround the city. But then the emperor dies. And so there's a retreat. They pull out, and then they come back in sometime later. It's in this period of calm that the Christians escape. And we have actual historical record of Christians who fled the city during that time where the Roman army had backed out. And then the Roman army comes back in, and they set up bulwarks and surround the city and besiege the city, and eventually the city is destroyed. That in mind, let's keep reading. Verse 20. When you see, again, who's he talking to? The people that are standing there. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Those who are in the midst of the city must leave, and those who are in the country must not enter the city. Because these are days of vengeance, so that all things which are written, there it is, Phil, will be fulfilled. That's the fulfillment of the Jewish purpose, right? Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days, for there will be great distress upon the land and wrath to this people. And they will fall by the edge of the sword and will be led captive into all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Who was it that destroyed the city? The Gentiles, the Romans. Right? So notice what he says here. First of all, Jerusalem's going to be surrounded. When you see Jerusalem surrounded, what? Get out of town. Get out of Dodge. And if you're in the country, leave the city. If you're in the country, don't go back into the city. Because if you get caught in the city, it's going to be too late. And you're going to be destroyed. So Jesus is prophesying about what happens nearly 40 years later. Okay? Now, some people think that the address changes in verse 25 to the end of times. But it doesn't. He's still talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Notice, verse 25 says, there will be signs in sun and moon and stars, in the earth dismayed among nations, in perplexity of roaring by the seas and the waves, men fainting from fear and the expectation of things which are coming upon the world, for the powers of heaven will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with power and great glory. But when these things begin to take place, straighten up, lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. Now, is Jesus talking about the second coming of Christ, or is he talking about the destruction of Jerusalem? Well, he can't be talking about the second coming of Christ. Why not? 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, and we don't have time to read all of these, but if you're making notes, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 1 through 6, but at the times and seasons, brethren, you have no reason that I write unto you, for yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so cometh as a... When they say peace and safety, then sudden destruction shall come upon them as travail upon a woman with a child, and they shall not escape. But that day should not overtake you, because you're in light, not in darkness. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 10. What signs will be given to the second coming of Christ? It will be as in the days of Noah. Will there be a warning? Will there be signs? Jesus said, no man knows the day, and there won't be any signs. It'll happen like a thief in the night. All right. So he can't be talking about the second coming of Christ because he says there's going to be signs. These apocalyptic signs. He's talking about the Romans. So what does he mean then when he says, then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with power and glory? First of all, the Romans... God has always done this. Throughout history, God has used other nations to do his will, other armies to do his will. He uses the Syrians, he uses the Babylonians, right? To bring judgment upon the people. Who is going to send the Roman army? God is. Christ is going to send them. But the other thing I think is this. Do they believe him? He says, tear down this temple, and he's talking about himself, right? But he says, tear down this temple, and in 3 days I'll do what? I'll rebuild it. And they go, it took how many years for this temple to be built, and you're going to build it in 3 days? You're not going to tear this temple down. You don't have that kind of power. Do they believe him? Do the Jews believe that God is going to allow his temple and his city to be destroyed? 40 years later, the Roman army sacks the city, desecrates the temple, and burns it to the ground. And what do you think the Jews think of? Who do they see but Jesus? Who do they remember? They remember that he told them this? I've used this example before. If I told you that 40 years from today, an alien ship is going to land out here in the front yard. And little green men are going to get out and they're going to run around the building. You're all going to look at me and think I'm crazy. And I die tomorrow. 40 years from now, most of you will probably have forgotten about me. I mean, you won't, but most And 40 years from today, a spaceship lands out in the front yard and little green men get out and run around the building. Who's the first person you think of? Preacher told us, man, we thought he was crazy. When they see the temple destroyed, they're going to know Jesus was right. And that he was who he said he was. Now, that being said, let's go on here. So he tells them a parable, verse 29. Behold the fig tree and all the trees. As soon as they put forth their leaves, you see it and know for yourselves that summer is near. So you also, again, who's he talking to? He's talking to those people that are there. So you people, when you see these things happening, recognize what? The kingdom of God is near. And here's the kicker, verse 32. Truly I say to you, this generation will what? This generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So either everything that Jesus just said has already happened, or there's some really old people running around somewhere. Right? Jesus says, this generation will not pass away. 40 years later, this generation is still there, right? So then in verse 33, he says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. So I had somebody the other day ask me, what does that verse mean? What does verse 33 mean in the context? Again, I think this is one of those verses that we have taken out of context. A lot of times we've just talked about, well, heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word will never pass away. But in the context, what does it mean? What's he saying? Go back to the very beginning. How did this whole conversation start? The scribes and the Pharisees, what they put their faith and their trust and their hope in. And the widow who did what? Who gave all, putting her faith and trust in God. And the scribes and the Pharisees and the people were putting their faith and trust in the physical things. Look at this temple. It is the temple of God in the city of God. Look how blessed we are. And Jesus says one of these days this temple's going to be gone. Then what will you have? What will you have? Heaven and earth. Physical things. The word heaven here in its context means the place in the sky where the sun and moon and all that stuff is. The physical heavens. In this earth. One of these days, all this is going to be gone. But what will remain? The words that he spoke. So where do we put our faith and trust? Again, it goes back to the heart, right? Do we put our faith and trust and hope in the things of this life or in Christ? So he says, be on guard, so that your hearts will not be weighed down. There it is. Is this about the heart? Be on guard so that your hearts are not weighed down with dissipation, drunkenness, and the worries of life. That day will not come upon you suddenly like a trap. For it will come upon all those who dwell on the face of all the earth. But keep on alert at all times, praying that you might have strength to escape all these things that are, this is another indication, that are what? They're about to take place. Would we say something is about to take place and 2,000 years from now it still hadn't happened? Would we say that? Could we say these things are about to take place and in the next 30 years it happens? Now, during the day he was teaching in the temple. In the evening he would go out and spend the night on the Mount of Olives. And all the people would get up early in the morning and come to hear him in the temple, to listen to him. It amazes me that Luke ends that part of the gospel with that phrase. Because beginning in the next chapter, or the next paragraph, what's he begin to tell them? How they wouldn't listen to him and how they would put him to death. And that's where we'll begin next week. Any thoughts or comments on anything we've talked about today?
verse 35,
Mm-hmm.
come as a snare of all who dwell on the face of the whole earth.
Again, I think this goes back to your question. The Gentiles, we just got a couple minutes, so I'm going to say this and then I'll run. The Gentiles were still amenable to the patriarchal law. They weren't amenable to the old law. The law of Moses was given to who? The Jews. But it won't be long, in the next year or so after this takes place, that the gospel will be preached to who? The Gentiles as well. Once the gospel is preached to both Jew and Gentile, the doors of the kingdom are open to everyone on the face of the earth. And the temple is destroyed. The only thing left is the kingdom of God, Christianity, the last dispensation of time. Does that make sense? And so the effect here is going to be on the entire world. And that's it. We no longer need a physical temple. Why? Because we are the temple of God. He abides in us, not there, not in the physical, now it's spiritual. Which God's intent was always what? That it be about the heart and it be from the heart. The old law was only intended to bring us unto Christ. Right? All right. Thank you.